And a lot of this stuff that we just started talking about is in that book that I mentioned by Spencer Sunshine, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism. I got mine right from the publisher Routledge. You got that book from the author, and you read it. And what did you think about it?
I was amazed. It is not a smear. I was looking for a smear, but it wasn't. It is in no way a smear. And it's a hell of a lot of good history. He's got some gaps and he's got some holes. But it's the, I guess, not necessarily the first of its kind, but it's probably the best of its kind to date.
Welcome to the Empire Never Ended podcast with Boris and Ray.
Hello.
And today, I always rhyme it with today, Ray, today.
Yeah.
We are very happy to be joined by Spencer Sunshine. Hello, Spencer.
Hi.
Hello.
Spencer is the author of Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism, The Origins and Afterlife of James Mason's Siege. Spencer, welcome to the show.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad to be on. I have some friends who are dedicated listeners. And they keep asking me every time, like, when I'm going to be on the show. So,
well, I was going to say, I mean, your book is probably, I'd say, the most anticipated book we've had, in the sense that tons of listeners have written to us about, even before it came out, when they're like, oh, have you seen this book? Have you seen this book? Have you thought about getting Spencer Sunshine on the show? So, here you are. Very excited about this.
That's cool. I think some of those might have been my friends, but
you'd be surprised. There were a lot. You might have a lot of friends, but
yeah, wow, that's cool. Yeah, it's always kind of weird to hear people, honestly be into the book. I wrote it just because I wanted to, so it's I'm always a little pleasantly surprised that it's meaningful to other people as well.
I mean, it's a particularly kind of niche subject.
Yes.
I was actually going to ask you, you said you wrote it because you wanted to, but how did you get interested in this? I mean, as fellow, weirdos who have, read Siege, and, aren't Nazis, how did that happen for you?
Fellow nerds of post-war fascism.
Yes.
So I was at the Charlottesville demonstration and in the car attack, and there was an incredible fixation by 4chaners and et cetera, back when that was a going thing afterwards, who were trying to dox me and yada, yada, yada. And so kind of laying low, and I was writing it. I was still at that point a fellow at this think tank that shall not be named because of bad feelings. And right after Charlottesville, interest in Siege spiked. There was an interesting Rolling Stone article, and they show a graph, like they showed how many searches for Siege and Read Siege happened, or postings right afterwards. And so a lot of people were writing about it, but they weren't writing about what was in the book.
Mm-hmm.
They were writing about Atomwaffen and So I started an article. Is basically I was going to, read Siege, describe what was in the book and write a little background about Mason. And I couldn't get the facts to line up about it, which is something I realized was a bigger problem later and led to part of the book. And I realized, through Googling that there was a archive of about 60 boxes of his correspondence in Kansas at the University of Kansas in Lawrence.
Wow.
So I went there thinking I would just clear some stuff up, and with not a whole lot of thought about the counterculture angle. I was like, well, let me look at those letters for sure. But and so I got there and I started reading this stuff, and it just sort of blew me away. I realized that there was this whole untold story about American neo-Nazism in the 70s that was quite important.
Yeah.
And that the involvement of these counterculture guys, who I, definitely knew the controversies of, sometimes had seen play, had mutual friends with. It laid it all out. It was really there was a ton of stuff that people didn't know before. It was sort of multiple smoking guns. And you've covered a lot of these figures on the show and talked about the kind of things they've said and done in their letters to James Mason.
Yeah, I think your book really kind of ends all of these decades-long debates that go like, is Boyd Wright a Nazi? Is this guy a Nazi? Is that guy a Nazi? Because I think after your book, it's very clear that yes, they are Nazis.
Yes.
And
thank you for putting an end to those debates.
yes.
Well, I didn't really, as you may notice in the book, don't really explain any conclusions or plummet to their intentions. I just describe what they said and did, and people can then make their own conclusions from these things.
Yes. I mean, and also we got like reactions after covering some of those figures in episodes that were based on your book. Like a few people wrote to us who said, wow, I was a part of that scene in the 90s in some way, and I was so naive and so on. There was no like pushback, like the usual kind of way people say, well, actually, they're just edgelords or whatever. People were just saying, wow, I was naive to believe that they were not Nazis.
I've had a number of people come to me and say the same things. I think we have some distance from the 90s too, so people aren't like so tied to that subculture. I mean, I was part of it in the 90s for sure. I mean, we knew these people were sketchballs, and when we read things like Apocalypse Culture, I had been around neo-Nazis, so this wasn't like, ooh, some crazy fringe thing. We were kind of like, what the fuck is that stuff? We would like to go with like research, not Feral House, the Research Press. But yeah, I've had people do that. I had a woman who was, I talked about her at the beginning, Adam Parfrey's cat sitter. A nice Jewish woman, had published stuff on Feral House, a little bit kooky stuff about conspiracy theories and zines. And she was I met her before the book came out, and she was very interested. And afterwards, she was like, he used me, didn't he? Yeah. And I was like, yeah, probably.
Yeah. So how do you feel about James Mason liking your book?
Well, he's made some sort of backhanded comments in other places that I at some places he's more favorable. I don't know. I am pleased in a way. Like it is a straight up book. The first half is a fairly straight up history about, neo-Nazism in the 70s. I've read tons of leftist histories in my life, and I kind of tell it the same way one might tell the history of Trotskyist splinter groups of like organizations and ideology and stuff. And the second half, and so I think I can understand why he would like that. The former head of the head of the order or the New Order, the previous American Nazi Party, likes the book as well, Martin Kerr.
Interesting.
I interviewed him for the book, and he said, you are like almost one of the two journalists that I've talked to in amongst dozens of journalists who've quoted me directly. They didn't misquote me. They didn't like write something denouncing me, that you were fair and accurate. And I was like, okay. I mean, I think that's good. You don't want to, I don't see the use of manipulating facts or history. The second half, Mason, I think, is very proud of his lineage. And he did eventually realize these guys weren't neo-Nazis. But I'm sure he's fine with that. They served his ends. And, we haven't talked to people, haven't listened to the other shows. It's the Feral House publisher, Adam Parfrey, the musician and writer, Michael Moynihan, who wrote Lords of Chaos, the industrial musician, Boyd Rice, and Nicholas Schreck, who was in a Radio Werewolf and is a Satanist, those four. And so, I don't know, Mason is very proud of his lineage, his history in the movement. He acts very much like a leftist a lot. I mean, he made all this internal correspondence with these figures and many others publicly available. And so he is for us, maybe I was providing smoking guns. For him, I was just explaining what had gone on in his life and his relationships with others.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously like a very deranged person, because he says that he likes the book, but in the book you very clearly demonstrate using his own correspondence that he's a pedophile, for example. And like even worse than we knew, because he would publicly state that he's into like teenage people, like sexually into them, but like in his correspondence, we can see that he's like into small children and incest and stuff like that.
Oh, I don't think he has any shame about it.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't think it bothers him.
He himself gave all of those letters to the university archive, like so.
Yeah, he did remove the photos, as far as I can tell.
Okay,
which were, I mean,
yeah, I guess a smart move on his part.
Yeah.
There is online a large collection of photos he was going to use for a George Lincoln Rockwell book that Adam Parfrey was going to publish that didn't happen. I think like 100 or hundreds of them, but they don't include, child porn. Yeah. He at one point says that when his house is raided, I'm glad they didn't find that other photo album.
Oh Jesus.
Yeah.
That's Mason for you.
Yeah. So, I mean, there you go.
Okay. So let's talk about Siege. Siege is often like praised by some of Mason's followers as kind of a up-to-date Nazi book that's like unlike all of the old-fashioned things that I don't like so much, the movementarian stuff, which they call it like that. But it's there is some kind of a Siege is not completely coherent in terms of strategies that it proposed. There are at least two, right?
Yes, total attack or total dropout. He pithily summarizes it as.
Well, that will be the kind of the second strategy that he proposes. Doesn't he have more kind of in first stage, like when Siege was published as a newspaper, he was more into like guerrilla warfare, right? Something like the order. I guess.
The problem with it was funny because I read all of the issues of Siege. They're like 72. They came out as clockwork. They were mimeographed. He had a printer make the red masthead, and then he wrote it. It was 6 pages almost, I think, always, and mimeographed it. The problem with the book, which is an abridged anthology of these of the newsletters, is it flattens out time in it. You know what I mean? Because it's by sections. It's like, here's all the stuff about violence, and here's philosophical stuff, and here's historical stuff. If you read the newsletters in order, the NSLF, the group at first, the National Socialist Liberation Front, that he's publishing it sort of as the theoretical organ of from 1980 to 1982, they're focused on guerrilla warfare.
Yeah.
And so there's more guerrilla warfare at the beginning. There's also the leaderless resistance, single actor attack stuff as well. And that kind of goes away. And there's like more of a pessimism as the issues go on. He talks a little more about the total dropout stuff, although he doesn't develop it very much, but he does start talking about that more. He gets more pessimistic as it goes on until in the end, he's very demoralized.
Yeah. I mean, I guess Siege is not like the texts in it are not in chronological order. So these things are mixed up, right? Like you have,
because they're pieces of sometimes it's not even like a paragraph of something, or so. Michael Moynihan, who edited it, took different things over the 6 years, different articles, different pieces of the articles, and put them together by subject and theme.
Yeah, because so you would have things like praising, things like that NSLF did, which Nazis call guerrilla warfare. Although I don't know, it's I guess inspired by like leftist urban guerrillas, I guess, as they see it. And then the other thing is when he really gets pessimistic is more like, well, actually what serial killers do, that's what we should be doing.
I don't know at what point the serial killers come in, but they do. I mean, he's inspired partly by Joseph Paul Franklin, who's a friend of his, who was a serial killer, most famous for shooting and paralyzing the Hustler publisher Larry Flint. Fun fact, happened in my hometown of Lawrenceville, Georgia, about a mile from my house.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But do you know? Go on.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm confused a little bit about this guerrilla like vision that they have, or how did they do it? Because NSLF, unlike the Order, was like a publicly existing group, right? That had a leader. So how would they do like all of these things that they claimed that they did, which were like illegal and so on? So
they start in 1974, and they copy the first leader, Joseph Tomasi, is looking at the Weather Underground and especially the Symbionese Liberation Army, Symbionese, the SLA. And there's a back and forth with the SLA throughout this book, if you look at it carefully. And some of these groups generally had an overground component. Like Prairie Fire was the overground legal part of Weather. But this is what happened. This is a common critique of the Black Panthers, is that they were they both had a public. They both were doing public organizing and had like public headquarters buildings, and were doing armed stuff as well. And this became a big failing of them because you ended up being a sitting target.
Right.
The original NSLF look like them. The name is the National Socialist Liberation Front, so it's taken off of all these, leftist groups at the time. The militant ones were liberation fronts.
Yeah.
And so he's acting in public. Tomasi's acting in public. He's publishing papers. At one point, they have a bookstore briefly, and then at night going out and doing stuff. It never really quite reaches guerrilla warfare. I think they bombed some leftist bookstores, which in the early 70s wasn't as unusual as it might be now. There's a huge spate of bombings in the United States.
Yeah, there were bombings like weekly all over the country.
Yeah, people are hijacking airplanes. Like we haven't seen that since 9/11, really. I mean, this was like leftists would just hijack an airplane and fly to Cuba. So it wasn't so crazy what they were saying or doing in the context of the time, right? But mostly, yeah, it acted as the NSLF was more radical on paper, especially when Carl Hand took over around 1981. The period in between, there were these two guys, David Rust and then Duffy, who were the leaders. And I talked to Rust, who was in prison for pedophilia. I exchanged about a dozen letters with him. Guy had basically a photographic memory. He, from memory, drew the cover of one of the issues of the NSLF publications he had made in the 70s.
Damn.
I was like super impressed. Yeah, I mean, he could answer very, very niche details. And I mean, this, was getting 40 plus years ago. And so, yeah, mostly though, these guys got in a lot of trouble. They were both arrested for like attempted murder and gun charges and stuff. But mostly, especially when Carl Hand took over, they were saying and promoting a lot of this in public, but there wasn't an underground component to it, right? Whereas the Order was an all underground group, right? And they were using the movement in general as the above ground stuff, like the National Alliance and White Aryan Resistance and all that. But they didn't have an above ground component. So when Metzger and Mason say that the NSLF and Tomasi are the direct predecessors of the Order, that's not really true. There's a change with the Order, and then there's also a change with what Mason is advocating, right? There's a real break with what Mason advocates than the Turner Diaries or any of this other stuff.
Yeah, is there any evidence that like the Order people even knew about NSLF or something like that?
I haven't run into that. I have not looked into the Order deeply. There's a couple of books about them, which is actually very unusual for post-war American fascists. There's almost none that there are actually two books about them, by third party.
Yeah, as we have found doing research for the show,
Right. I got this weird review, and the guy said, there's libraries of books about neo-Nazi terrorism. And I'm like, I can't think of a single standalone book that's not about a single group. And I had to really, prod people to even name books anywhere in the world that were English language books. Like we got maybe half a dozen, maybe. So as you all know, I mean, this is partly why your show is so interesting. Like a lot of the stuff just isn't talked about and covered. There aren't good articles. There aren't books. The people don't explore this stuff in depth. They're looking at it more now, but like before Trump won, this stuff was almost entirely ignored except by a small group of, people in the SPLC or these other monitoring agencies. Right. And the archives didn't collect this stuff, which made the James Mason archive really, really unusual. I don't think there's anything like it in the U.S. because I did travel around and visit different archives.
Do you know why he chose that particular library?
Well, my understanding, and I should talk to the curators, is that he was collecting American Nazi Party, paraphernalia and memorabilia and stuff, photos and things, because he knew he was a member from the 60s, and he, of course, knew party members, and he was buying and selling it. And so I think it's my understanding that he established a relationship with the Kansas Archive and had sold them some Rockwell stuff. They had an existing archive called the Laird Wilcox Collection, who was one of these anti-extremist dudes. So there's a big collection of radical left and far right stuff existing. And then, so I think he was already selling them stuff. So he created a relationship and then sold them all of his stuff, I think, in phases.
There was even a claim that NSLF didn't actually do all of the like militant terrorist things that they claimed, that they made some kind of an alliance with a Cuban anti-communist group who actually did it, and then they would claim it, right? Yes,
there was that accusation. I asked David Rust about this. He kind of settled it for me, and he said Tomasi would not. Tomasi did claim they did it. That Tomasi would not falsely claim something.
Okay.
That anything he said he would do. And that does seem fully legitimate to me. I mean, he was clearly a hothead who was like, gung-ho on violence. So
okay.
I do believe that. But yes, that was the accusation that they had made an alliance with an armed anti-Castro Cuban group. Again, at the time, there were more of these running around, and that they did the actions on behalf of the NSLF.
Okay. So in the later stages of Siege, the newspapers, Mason adopted this Charles Manson ideology, or his synthesis of National Socialism and Charles Manson, which he called universal order. So why do you think he was into Manson? Was it because he thought there's like a wider like social interest into Charles Manson, as a phenomenon, or because he was popular among like countercultural types, or did he actually want Nazis to emulate like Charles Manson's example?
Well, all of them. He references Manson family people in the 70s in his other publications at the time. In 1981, he writes Squeaky and Sandra Good to Lynette Fromm as Squeaky, who were two imprisoned Manson family members. He was starting to write. He had a practice of writing prisoners, which is a fairly common thing for very radical groups who can't do, organizing and don't have a lot of followers. This isn't something they can do because prisoners, are bored and need support, or will write back. You can try to recruit or support white supremacists who are in prison, or whatever. For radical leftists, they can do the same. And I think he was just kind of fishing around, and he had the address of the Squeaky and Good and wrote them. And then they introduced him to Charles Manson in 1982, and he became quickly interested and formed a relationship with Charles Manson, although he never visited him in person. That's when he started creating his ideology that Manson should be the new, basically, Adolf Hitler, that Manson was a spiritual leader. And he should be. Mason wanted a living spiritual leader. This was or neo-Nazi leader, since Rockwell was dead and Hitler was dead. He thought that was important. He was very well aware that young people were interested in Charles Manson, and this became very important later as the 80s and 90s went on. And he knew, and he says this very explicitly, he could use this as a hook that people would like it, young people would like it just for its extremism, and then he could sort of reel them in and then, proselytize to them and politicize them. This was the technique used by George Lincoln Rockwell, to, raise the swastika and his language, attract media attention. People would like it for the outrageousness of doing that, back when it was outrageous to have a swastika in public in the 50s and early 60s. And then once they were interested, then give them all of your propaganda. And this is also what Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan did. And so James Mason admired both of them for that. And he explicitly was doing the same thing with Charles Manson. So it was both. And then he changed his own, James Mason changed his own beliefs to make a fusion of Charles Manson's, semi-Gnostic ideas with National Socialism, which is what Universal Order is. So both at the same time.
Okay. And do you think that Charles Manson and his people were genuinely supportive of this Universal Order idea?
Yes, I do. He was in touch with, James Mason was in touch with Charles Manson through, I think the last letter that Mason writes him is 1989. It's not replied to. So the whole time Siege is being published. And he's also friends with Squeaky and Good. There's pictures of him visiting them.
Yeah.
So yeah, he definitely, he has the stamp of approval for sure. At one point, Mason recruits a fascinating guy. You should do a show on him. I'm not sure there's enough information. Perry Red Worthen.
Yeah.
He's my favorite character in the book. Of all of these just wild characters in the book, he visits Charles Manson on James Mason's behalf 4 times.
Who is he? I don't actually know this name.
We mentioned him. He's the guy who used to be an anarchist.
Okay.
But it's a very sad story. He murdered a kid when he was a child himself, right?
Yeah, he was a teenage pyromaniac. He was put in a youth home when he was 13 or 14, he murdered a 10-year-old, quote, because he was bored.
Damn.
He got out as an adult. He said he became a biker and the cops raided his house and took his gun. So he became an anarchist. But then he became a pacifist anarchist and a very pro LGBTQ one, which was unusual, was not a usual thing for anarchists in the States in the 70s to be, and also a big supporter of movements of people of color like Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers.
Huh. He was a wobbly, right?
He was a wobbly. He was on the general executive board of the Wobblies and of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And but most importantly, he formed his own, quote, group called the Woodstock Anarchist Party. They published a pretty good anarchist magazine called the Anarchist Black Hammer. They have buttons. I actually, when I was writing the book, bought an Anarchist Woodstock Party button, Woodstock Anarchist Party button. And were known in the 70s. There weren't a lot of anarchist groups in the U.S., so they were pretty well known. And I was told that if you wrote them, then he made you a member, right? But they were very visible. If you know American anarchists from the 70s, they'll pretty much all know the Woodstock Anarchist Party. Then he disappears at one point around 78, quits the Wobs, gets rid of his party, pops back up as a Klan member, I think, and then a neo-Nazi.
Wow.
And then he starts visiting Charles Manson on James Mason's behalf. And then in short order, he's in his 40s now, murders a teenage follower of his. He's recruited a bunch of teenagers in Oroville, California, and then murders one of them for a very dumb reason. Goes to jail. He's like into Christian identities, like a CI preacher, goes to jail, then says he reads the Bible, and then gives up his racism, realizes that Christianity is not like some weird white, white ethnocentric religion, which it's clearly not, is born again and then dies at a fairly young age, I think, probably in his 50s. And I know most of this because he wrote an autobiography for one of these like born again websites that caters to, that specifically does ministry to prisoners.
Okay,
interesting.
I didn't know that.
So he has just this wild story. I mean, the guy has problems, and it's pretty dangerous to be around him. But
yeah, but Perry Wharton was actually the first Nazi who made contact with Charles Manson, right?
Well, James Mason was already in contact with him.
Oh, he was. Okay.
Well, no, I found out too, writing the book, that in the 70s, right after he goes to jail, can we call him Charlie just to, because then we get the Mason Manson thing.
Yeah.
I put that in my book originally, and the publishers made me change it. Like, even when I looked at the draft, I messed their names up and confused them. So when Charlie went to jail, he made an alliance with the Aryan Brotherhood.
Yeah.
That lasted for a while. And so he was already in contact with Brotherhood people. They fell out. I found out that a lot of Brotherhood dudes on the outside got together with Manson family girls and then went and murdered a whole bunch of people together.
Oh, wow.
Like, the Manson family killed a huge amount of people, the whole family. A really kind of astounding number of people, like much more than you would think. So there was one case in which a Brotherhood family joint group murdered. They were staying with this couple, and they murdered both the husband and the wife, and then buried one of them in the basement of the house they were staying in. So while Charlie's in jail.
Yeah, I heard about it. You know about, there is an opposite example of Perry Wharton. There was a guy who was in the Manson family and like connected with the Aryan Brotherhood and was a part of one of the robberies they did together.
Larry Giddings.
Yes, yeah. And then he became an anarchist later when he was in prison, right?
Yes, he do. I have mutual friends with Little Larry, as he was called at the time.
Yeah. Okay. So on our podcast, we talked about Tom Metzger. And so Metzger in the early 90s became a supporter of Mason and of Siege. And we had an idea that maybe this happened after Metzger was like financially ruined first in a court case that SPLC had against him. And also because as a result of that, he was denounced by some of fellow Nazis like Ed Fields, who said that basically because I think the court case in the end resulted in Metzger having to give part of his profit from publishing to SPLC. So Ed Fields was like, okay, Metzger is now basically working for the Jews. So we had an idea that maybe he was so devastated by this development that he turned to something extreme as Siege. I don't know if that's what you think happened there.
Well, yes and no. Metzger was in contact with Mason while Siege was originally being published. Mm-hmm. It was kind of interesting that Mason wrote. So Metzger was running for office in California in the early '80s and did incredibly well. I think at one point he wins the Democratic primary for Congress, as I recall. Although he's beaten, in the general, he gets an astounding number of votes. It was actually that period right after Reagan's elected that neo-Nazis do really well in a few places in the elections.
Right.
Is it Covington in North Carolina who does really well in the Attorney General?
Yes.
vote?
Yes.
Yeah, and a couple other cases. It's really kind of interesting. And then Duke kind of starts his David Duke gets his takeoff at this period. So Mason writes Metzger after one of these, electoral, they're not victories, but good returns, which is unusual because why would he care about, this is a sort of reformist strategy that he's rejecting, but he likes Metzger and they stay in touch. Metzger says he's very disappointed when Siege ends. And then he actually asks Mason to write for his newspaper, White Aryan Resistance, and Mason does start writing for War starting in 1987 and running the whole time in prison. He writes for them. He writes dozens of articles for War. So Metzger doesn't get interested in Mason after the SPLC suit.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But he does move towards, we'll use the term, often leaderless resistance is the term used, or lone wolves, but I think there's a lot of questions about the real meaning of that. And so I tend to use single actor incidents or massacres. So clearly after the Metzger, whose minions murdered an Ethiopian immigrant in 1988 in Portland, Oregon, Metzger sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center in a civil suit, an innovative civil suit, loses. War as an organization is gone. He still has the newspaper, right? And his wages are garnished essentially.
Yeah.
And definitely at that point, he moves towards, advocating leaderless resistance and single actor attacks. Like he's also okay with other, I think, forming groups like the Order. The Order supposedly gives him a bunch of money.
Yeah.
From their bank robberies. So does he move closer to Mason? He certainly moves closer to these ideas, but these ideas are floating around, right? Louis Beam's essay, Leaderless Resistance, comes out in 1983, and Metzger comes from a Klan background. So in a sense, these ideas are around there. I mean, Mason's unusual in that he was such an early advocate of them, starting in the 1970s, and that also he has a different meaning of them than the others. This is why his stuff is different than Pierce or the Order or something, right? Because he's breaking with this idea of a movement. And I think Metzger still has an idea of being part of the movement. It's a little unclear. It'll be an interesting. Metzger's one of these guys. I think he's a really interesting guy. Mm-hmm. I think he's pretty sharp, and his analysis is actually it's more unusual than people would think. Like at one point later on, he's like, it really isn't about, the main problem isn't the Jews. It's about, people who run these multinational corporations, and they are largely white. They're white Christians. Jews are part of it, and there is a Jewish conspiracy, but we should not fool ourselves that a big part of our problem are other white people, right? It's an unusual view for white supremacists to take. So it'd be good to track the evolution of Metzger's ideas. There is a book called 100 Little Hitlers that focuses on his relationship to Portland and the scene there. But yeah, the development of Pierce and Metzger about violence along with Mason is a interesting. They're taking slightly different paths. Pierce isn't influenced by Mason, but they are very close early on, and then Mason kind of breaks with him.
I always had this thought about Mason, though. I read Siege a long time ago. That was in when we first started the podcast, and I always, you said that he did break from the kind of movementarian tradition and criticized it.
That's
a lot.
his term, I guess. Right?
Yeah, that's his term, and he's not.
Is that his or is that Denton's term?
Maybe Denton has a text using that term, but
yes,
I assumed it comes from James Mason, but I'm not sure.
I don't think it does, but I don't. He could have coined it later. I don't remember him using it, but yes, that's the concept that.
But I think his attraction to Metzger is that he's a guy that had greater appeal, right? This is the type of thing that he is still attracted to these people, despite not wanting advocating more for this.
Metzger's fine with violence, and eventually advocates violence after he backs up a little while he's running for office, for I'm sure practical reasons. But Metzger's also doing something different, right? Mason was very unhappy with the National Socialist movement in America. He saw it as kind of just doing the same thing in a cycle that wasn't getting anywhere, which he was right about. And he saw Metzger thinking about things in a different way, and I think that was part of.
Yeah, and I think he was like, "Oh, this guy can get 60,000 votes," and he's doing something right, I guess.
Right. I don't know. I think they just kind of clicked about stuff. They were both interested in trying something new, and they both had a kind of blasé. They promoted, but also had personally a blasé relationship with violence. It didn't bother them that they were advocating people being killed and that people were then being killed. It doesn't bother Mason now. Obviously, it doesn't bother him, and Metzger wasn't bothered by these things either.
Yeah. So I want to ask you something about Mason's relationship with William Pierce. I think it's kind of interesting to me. I think there's some contradiction in there, but maybe not. Because So one of the main points of like Mason's ideology is his critique of what we call movementarian, which means like Nazis who have like membership-based official legal organizations. And more than that, William Pierce also, he, renounced using the swastika, which was an anathema to James Mason. And so National Alliance was the most successful group coming out of organized by someone coming out of American Nazi Party, and had a pretty big membership and some influence. And William Pierce compared National Alliance with groups in Europe, such as the National Democratic Party in Germany and the British National Party, who are like, we know them to be fascist, but were trying to be mainstream organizations that appealed to middle-class normal people, let's say, which is, completely the opposite of what James Mason wants. And he really denounces those types of organizations. But at the same time, he has lots of respect for William Pierce. And I think was officially like a supporter of National Alliance for a long time.
I got the membership receipts.
Yeah. And considers him, William Pierce, his mentor. So that's kind of strange. But on the other hand, although William Pierce was doing all of that, at the same time, he was an advocate of extreme violence, and he's the author of the Turner Diaries in Hunter, which is very much, very close to Siege in its approach, and is still praised by all of the Siege people.
Well, it's you're picking out some of these contradictions quite well, I think. So Pierce was Mason's mentor when Mason must have been 16. Mason says, he tells the story a lot, that he was going to do a school shooting, and instead he called the headquarters of the American Nazi Party, which by then had become the National Socialist White People's Party, the NSWPP. Yeah. And Pierce answered, and Pierce said, hey, why don't you come to party headquarters? And so Mason spent a couple of years there till he was 18. And so Mason credits Pierce with saving his life. And they were tight. They stay in touch. Mason goes and visits him. Mason goes to jail in 1970, I think 4 or 5. He gets out in 75. He had this whole thing. He committed multiple violent crimes against teenagers. The first one is that him and his friend Greg Hurls take a car out for a test drive and then mace a bunch of black kids, including like a 13-year-old girl. Yeah. And he goes to jail, and when he gets out, he's going to form a new group, which he does, called the National Socialist Movement, which is a fun fact. It's the same group that exists now and was at Charlottesville.
Is it really?
Yes, it is. So that was one thing I found in my book that took a lot of time, because I was trying to unweave the story of the NSM, which had been obscured by people and told different ways that wasn't right. In fact, I told Jeff Scoop how the party was formed, the leader for a long time, who's now a quote unquote former. And so what's interesting is after Mason got out of jail, Pierce invited him to move to Virginia and edit the party newspaper, the National Alliance's newspaper. They were that close. But Mason he had already a plan to form this new group that was similar to the National Socialist Liberation Front, and do his own thing. The NSM originally, their point was there were all these groups that splintered off. The NSWPP was to push these splinters towards violence, although it didn't succeed, and then changed into just another group doing the as he calls it, the uniform and demonstrate tactic. Right. So he's close to Pierce, and the interesting thing is, like, he's obviously reading the National Vanguard, I think is the National Alliance paper. Yeah. He's reading it. Mason is reading it while he is publishing his own things for the NSM. And I know this for a fact. I mean, it's obvious, but that it's like in one letter, he said, this is Pierce's newspaper is the only one I can recommend. So Mason starts to develop his ideas in the 70s about single actor attacks and stuff. And he's doing that while he's reading the serialization of the Turner Diaries, because Turner Diaries actually serialized in Pierce's newspaper between, I think, 75 and 78, and is published as a book in 78. So while Mason's developing his ideas, while he's literally driving to Virginia to visit Pierce, he's reading all the serializations of the Turner Diaries. So it's clear he's influenced by it. I think this would be a very interesting study to see the development of the two ideas side by side.
Okay.
But yes, Pierce does something else. He forms a membership-based groups. He doesn't use the swastika, which Mason said was absolutely important that groups do in public. But he liked the violence thing. I mean, I think if people advocated violence, even if it wasn't what he was saying, he was into it. Like he praises the order when they're arrested, and they're doing something quite different than he said. He didn't. Mason's not like they're back to guerrilla warfare. They're back to being like the armed wing of the white supremacist movement, which you can see by the fact they're giving the above ground leaders money, right? It's not Mason's strategy. But I think as somebody in that movement uses violence, especially neo-Nazis, he's not interested in clan violence. He almost never mentions this, except like
That
Bob
is
Miles.
interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, he does not like the Klan. He doesn't say this outright, but he has very tense relationships with them. He only likes one or two of the guys. Eventually, Bob Miles, and I think the Aryan Nations leader, which isn't coming to me right now.
Butler.
Richard Butler.
Richard Butler.
Yeah.
Yeah, he gains a begrudging respect for them. Part of it isn't like that they're Christian. He doesn't like the Christian thing. He's a devout atheist until he starts developing this universal order ideology, which he still thinks is an atheist ideology, but I would say is not. I mean, it's based on a lot of Charles Manson's ideas, and Manson's not an atheist. So there's a lot of Gnosticism mixed in there before Mason does actually become his own weird version of Christian in 94, 95.
Well, he's a Christian identity guy now, right?
Sort of. Yeah. At the beginning, he says, this is not Christian identity, although he later uses the term. He kind of develops his own version of racist, anti-Semitic UFO Christianity.
Yeah.
A lot of it's based on Eric von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods, which is this really weird book saying that ancient aliens were, anticipating astronauts and all these like images that old peoples like in the BC or Common Era made anticipated alien helmets or something, astronaut helmets, which, people only wore for like a 10 or 20 year period is the funny thing.
Yeah.
And then the Bible describes spaceships and stuff. And you'll see this very heavily in Mason's Christian work. He writes a bunch of books while he's in prison and then edits and publishes them afterwards himself, sometimes in spiral bound editions, which are in the archives.
I think there was an earlier connection between Christian identity and UFOs. I think we mentioned that in some of the episodes. I think maybe
yes, there was Swift made that connection.
Yeah.
There were some people who did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think Charlie was right when he was angry at these people like Boyd Rice and Michael Moynihan when he said Moynihan is an idiot. I think in that rant, Charlie said something like, all of these like people, they're like, they all say they are Nazis, but none of them want to follow orders or something like that. And I think Mason is the same because he praises, Tomasi as some kind of a visionary and martyr of the movement. But when Tomasi asked Mason to join his group, NSLF, he didn't want to. He started NSM, right?
Yeah. Yes, but he had a reason for that.
Yeah.
Well, there's two things. So Tomasi, yes, he's there's some letters between Mason and Tomasi, and Mason loves what Tomasi's doing, but he wants to do something a little different. He starts a propaganda effort to influence others while Tomasi is trying to start the revolution. And also Tomasi was like a very charismatic leader, and Mason didn't want to be under someone else. He had chafed under the leadership of Matthias Kale and stuff. So Mason kind of had his own thing going. He was in the Midwest and Tomasi was on the West Coast. So they didn't join up. With Charles Manson, when the Manson fetish creates a split. So people didn't know this either, is that James Mason secretly joined the NSLF in 1976 after Tomasi's killed. And he remains a member until 1982 when he breaks with the fourth leader, Carl Hand, and they break pretty much over the Charles Manson thing because Hand hates Charles Manson.
Yeah.
One of the things is Hand became sober when he joined the neo-Nazi movement, and that's clearly not what the Manson family's about. And this offends him. And Charlie's bisexual, and this super offends him. And doesn't dress, has this unusual way of dressing and acting and such.
Yeah.
So Carl hates him, and this is really the thing that precipitates the split between Mason and the NSLF, and this is when he quits and does his own thing. I think Charles Manson just realizes that I think he goes along with James Mason and Universal Order because at the time it seemed like Siege was promoting Charlie's ideas in a different format, and Charlie eventually realizes that this isn't helping him a lot, but also that James Mason, for him, National Socialism is always first, and that he is unwilling to truly accept Charlie as his cult leader and do whatever Charlie says. Mason still has a different agenda that's ultimately political. There's a huge, there are many, many, many letters at Kansas between the two, which I did not read. And I understand one of the family members said we used to, when Charlie was alive, we'd get letters from him and it would take us a week to read them. The first 4 days were just deciphering his handwriting.
Yeah.
I didn't even skim the letters because I was like, whoa, I can't do this. But they're in contact for a long time. And obviously, Charlie approves of the project. For a while, he kind of stops being involved. I think around 1984, Mason says, although they do stay in touch. But he realizes that Mason isn't going to totally subordinate himself. And, in this quote, Charlie's like, everyone wants to follow orders. Everyone wants to be the man. What is the quote? But they're not. They don't want to take orders. And it's the taking orders from Charlie, of course.
Yeah. I think if some years ago, I read on one of the pro Manson websites like a transcript of a letter by Charlie in which he refers to Rockwell as commander and said something how he was his follower, something clearly I think incorrect. I think there's a claim there that somehow Manson was into Rockwell independently of Mason, but I think that's it's probably some terminology that he picked up from James Mason while they were in contact, I assume. I don't know.
I guess it's possible. It's surely possible he knew about him. I mean, Rockwell was in the news and such, but I don't know anything about that. I mean, Charlie had his own weird mixture of, Scientology and some existing cult stuff and, Gnostic philosophy and other things going in, just like manipulation, like these manipulation techniques going on. So, but it was a fairly fluid thing. You could grab stuff, later on he forms or launches the Atwa ideology, air, tree, waters, animals, or all the way alive. And this is a real turn to get into ecology.
Yeah, I know that one of the reasons for the break that Mason made with Charlie was that Charlie would use the money that he got for organizations like Save the Whales and he didn't give it to Mason, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, Mason,
I didn't know
Mason was real bitter about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see Mason as a guy who gives any fucks about the whales.
No. So I knew that Siege, the newspaper, was not very influential and successful where it existed as in the newspaper form. But I was really surprised to read in your book that Mason said that the print run never exceeded 100 copies. And that at the end, when he gave up in 86, his mailing list only had 66 addresses. So that's really practically non-existent, right?
Yeah, and those 66, some of them he specifies are trades with other periodicals.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it wasn't, I think Metzger was the one person who was of any stature who read it and was influenced by it or liked it. Yeah. So it was incredibly unsuccessful. The other neo-Nazis hated the Charles Manson stuff. Pierce hated it. I think that was a cause they didn't talk for a long time. Even Metzger didn't like it. He asked Mason at one point to reprint an article. He says, but I'm going to take the Charlie stuff out of it.
Yeah.
Mason is strangely genial and cooperative, when it's useful to him. And so he was like, oh, okay, sure. He's got this deep voice. He was like, okay, right.
Yeah. So, so I come to my next question. So Siege obviously didn't have an influence while even among the Nazis while it existed as a newspaper, but we come to the Abraxas people, right? Who are they and what is their significance?
Yes, they became interested in him. So they are significant because they were fairly prominent figures in the 80s and 90s underground. We called it at the time the extreme culture. I was interested in some of this stuff in the early 90s. I was a very, very young punk rocker in the late 80s. But and so it was these four figures, I mentioned them before, and they were all working together. Boyd Rice, again, the industrial musician, Adam Parfrey, who was a publisher, founded the very well-known press Feral House, some people don't know about this unless they're in these counterculture circles, especially as time's gone on, but they sold hundreds of thousands of copies of books, and the books were made into movies. Parfrey is an obit in the New York Times when he died. He was like a fairly major figure outside of these circles, or a significant one. And then Michael Moynihan, who was this younger guy who was a industrial musician and then a neo-folk musician, played in a very mediocre neo-folk band called Blood Axis, but became more famous for, he was the publisher of Siege for co-authoring a book called Lords of Chaos about the Norwegian black metal scene. That's a very famous and a successful book. And then this other guy, Nicholas Schreck, who sort of played a walk-on but important role. And they formed essentially a paper organization called the Abraxis Foundation, or Rice and Schreck did, and for a brief period of time all worked together after they discovered Mason. So what happened is that the first guy, Boyd Rice, who is an incredible kind of networker, I think he's a sociopath. He says he is at one point, and I truly believe he's famous for being a sort of trend detector and being right above these niche underground trends, but also for knowing all kinds of people, collaborating with all kinds of people, and introducing them to each other. So he's in the crossroads of all of these things, even though frankly his own music isn't very good, and a lot of people are like, his reputation far exceeds his musical ability. I think he's got one or two good songs, but for a 40 whatever year career, this isn't saying a whole bunch.
Not great.
So Rice got interested in a sort of joint Hitler and Charles Manson fetish, looks like through the industrial music scene, especially through Genesis P-Orridge of Throbbing Gristle, the first main industrial band, who was interested in these things. And then Rice is running around. He runs into a firearms dealer at a gun show named Victor Malik. The guy's a neo-Nazi. And he tells Rice, he's like, well, there is an actual neo-Nazi who's friends with Charles Manson, and combines the two ideas together and gives him his address. And so Rice comes into contact, who's, again, a counterculturalist, not coming out of a political scene, and previously not political in the way that we're used to thinking about stuff, but into super transgressive music and art, contacts James Mason. And right when he does, Rice is visiting Charles Manson. A lot is made of this, but there's only, I think, like a 6-week period that he does that. But he contacts James Mason right then, because Mason even writes Charlie and says, hey, do you know this guy? And then Rice, being this networker, introduces Adam Parfrey to James Mason, introduces Michael Moynihan, and then Schreck kind of comes into contact. I think he knows Parfrey, and they're all in the same circles, and then the four of them start to work together. Moynihan joins a little later on. And so they spend, I think, 9 years, 86 to 94, after they've discovered, 86, 87, after they've discovered James Mason, trying to promote him and sell him in their little niche countercultural circles. So like Parfrey puts Mason, I think for the first time outside of a neo-Nazi magazine, in an art magazine he's editing called Exit. He's doing with a guy named George Petros, who later becomes a more prominent magazine editor. Puts him in the book Apocalypse Culture, Anna Parfrey Anthology. He publishes it on his own press. This thing is very, very famous. It's still in print. Supposedly it's going to go into a 4th edition. Had a big impact on the underground culture. And then Nicholas Schreck puts him in another book called The Manson File. Again, a book that's gone through many editions. Anna Parfrey published it. He puts Mason in The Manson File, a bunch of pages to James Mason. Yeah. And then puts him in a documentary called Charles Manson Superstar, which is filmed. It's a lot of interviews, I think in San Quentin, filmed with James Mason. And then he splices in footage of an interview. This is, I get it confused. A lot of San Quentin footage with Charlie, there we go, spliced in with a video interview with James Mason. And this is a hilarious story. One of the two people who do the video interview, a 1987 interview with James Mason, he contacted me, named Brian King, and he is the person that the comic book guy in The Simpsons is based on.
Wow.
So there's an interview with a writer, and the writer says, yeah, I went into this, I guess comic book guy's always eating like calamari or something. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I went into this bookstore in LA called Amok Books or something, and the guy was sitting behind the corner eating calamari. And I'm like, holy shit, that really is Brian.
Wow. Okay.
Right?
I did not expect this.
Yeah, right. It's the weird. I get a lot of people have come to me and contacted me and told me all these weird stories and stuff. That's definitely one of the more far out ones.
Yeah.
And then Rice also introduces this other guy, Michael Moynihan, to James Mason a little later on. And he's pretty talented in a bunch of different fields. He's a writer and a publisher and a publicist and a musician in different genres. Also collaborates with a lot of people. And then Moynihan becomes very important because he meets Mason, and then he does the most important thing is that he edits all the Siege newsletters into a book and then publishes the book himself. Now, funny thing is, Boyd Rice has not been before my book connected very much to James Mason. He didn't do almost anything in public. He appears on one radio show with him in '91, and if you happened to get hold of a book called Art That Kills, which was very obscure that George Petras published, there are I think one or two pictures of Rice with Mason. But his connection, a lot of people know about Rice and his connections to the neo-Nazi movement and Bob Hike and Tom Metzger, but not the pivotal role he played in discovering James Mason. As you said on your previous podcast, and I put in the book, he's the first person, I believe, to suggest that newsletters become a book. He does all these introductions, including to the eventual publisher of Siege. So he plays a key role that wasn't previously known.
So he's actually kind of lucky that he met that guy, Victor Malik or whatever. Yeah. So, I mean, Malik must have been one of the few subscribers to Siege at the time that would have known.
I don't even know if he liked Siege. I think I don't know.
But he knew about it at least.
He knew about
most
Siege
people
for
didn't.
sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure Siege was influenced. If you were in this very small world of National Socialism in the United States at the time, like there's a difference I learned writing the book between really committed ideological National Socialists and other white supremacists, even those who may use some Nazi symbolism or talk about Hitler. Like a lot of them, it's a mixture of stuff or they're not real deep into it. But for some of these guys, like they're really into the doctrine of it. They're sometimes not interested in other forms of white supremacy, right? And Mason's kind of like this. Like he's a believer in National Socialism, not in the white revolution per se.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so the Abraxas people are really crucial here. They made Mason in to what he is today, because Mason goes from like in 86 when he's ready to give up and is sending Siege to only 66 addresses into like being connected to relatively influential, relatively well-known people who are like friends with Marilyn Manson. And they're also like a crucial connecting point between Mason and Atomwaffen people. Because, for example, Denton, who's one of the leaders of Atomwaffen, he's really influenced by Abraxas people. And he says so. I think there is somewhere he made a post on the internet where he wrote, I was first red-pilled by people like Boyd Rice and Nicholas Schreck, for example. And I think in the ProPublica video, when they confront Denton and some other Atomwaffen people at like some metal show, Denton is wearing a Radio Werewolf t-shirt, which is Shrek's band. And also, I think his nickname Rape comes from Boyd Rice. Yeah.
I didn't know this. I do know the first Atomwaffen leader, Brandon Russell, when he gets out, there's a picture of him in a non-shirt, which was the name that Boyd Rice comes recorded under. I don't know that these guys didn't retroactively go back and explore Abraxis Foundation people, but I didn't know the stuff about Denton. I think it's a Horna show he's at, right, in Texas.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal because people were like, he's here. Like, are we going to go and confront him or not? But people did not. I mean, confront. Have a frank conversation as Antifa International. Describe some of these meetings. But yeah, these guys are the Abraxas Foundation people allow Mason to escape his the drain, not just the cul-de-sac of American National Socialism, but the drain he's going down, and give him a whole new audience. Give him a whole new lease on life, expose a whole new group of people to him that he would never have been able to access, and they would not have known about him. And it's very interesting. These guys are really into James Mason kind of specifically, especially to sell them. They do become friends with Tom Metzger and George Hawthorne of Rahowa, the band Rahowa Racial Holy War. But mostly it's Mason, and they like the Mason-Manson thing because they're really into Charles Manson as well. And that's crucial. And that's crucial to James Mason's, the selling of him to the counterculture, because there's this whole fetish in this extreme culture scene I was talking about with serial killers, with authoritarian leaders, with murderers, and with Charles Manson. And there's a rising fad about it that peaks right when Siege comes out in 1993. There's impeccable timing, which is funny because the book was delayed for years for various reasons with Moynihan, but it comes out right at the exact moment that the Charles Manson fad reaches its peak, which is when, strangely, Guns N' Roses covers a Manson song on their album Spaghetti Incident.
Yeah. Okay, so it's clear why James Mason loved the Abraxas people, but why do you think he was attractive to them? Was it the Charlie connection?
Why was Mason attracted to the Abraxas Foundation?
Why they found him attractive?
Yes, why did they find him attractive? I think there's multiple reasons. As I said, I don't delve into intent in the book at all. Obviously, people are interested in it. I think, yes, the Charlie thing. Second, just being part of that culture, they were just into all kinds of extremes. So this was perfect, right? They would talk about different terrorist groups, I think on the left and right, different kinds. And here was Mason, and it's not just that he was friends with Charles Manson, but he was promoting all these serial killers and all these murderers. He knew quite a number of them personally. At some point he even gets into things like the Tylenol poisonings in the 80s, which is when some person ran around and then copycats putting poison in Tylenol and killed some people. So they like that, what he's advocating, not so much, we can get into this about the National Socialism, but just the wildness of it. I mean, at some point, James Mason has this reason for talking about these violent figures. He thinks that he can, that they will be a tool to just create chaos and instability and collapse the government and society. But in reality, you read this stuff and he's just grooving on this stuff, right? He is just another serial killer fan, except he knows a lot of people he's in contact with. He just likes the violence and he doesn't engage in this himself. So he's a fanboy of school shooters and serial killers and stuff, just like so many other people are. So he shares that with him. And then these guys, they're right wingers, and then they become, and it's really, again, I just write what they say in the letters to him, how much and to what extent they become believers in National Socialism or at least fascism. And they all do to a greater or lesser extent. Yeah. And so there just is through their, what they already believe beforehand, and then through their work with Mason, move towards his politics in general. And for some of them, it stays their whole life. I think they all are far right figures. I interviewed Nicholas Schreck, I think a couple months ago now. I sent him a letter beforehand. He didn't reply. None of these people replied to me. Parfrey had died while I was writing the book. And Schreck, I had a long interview with Schreck, and he said he was the most interesting of them. He makes all these crazy statements while he's in touch with Mason. He gets on Tom Metzger's show, and he's like, we're against, we're against poisoning the gene pool and race mixing. And Abraxis Foundation wants to be a new Thule society and launch a new kind of National Socialist movement. That's what Mason becomes convinced, that these guys are creating a new form of National Socialism that extends his ideas basically into an artistic realm. Mason's an artist of types. He's a nice designer. I think he's you may disagree, he's a fine stylist. Siege is just, Moynihan wasn't a talented editor, right? The newsletters are 6 pages long. And, Mason can write fine, unlike many neo-Nazis. And he appreciates what these guys are doing aesthetically. He thinks they're taking his ideas and helping create a whole new kind of National Socialism, which they're not, but they are creating a kind of fascist counterculture, and they want to create a lineage that goes back to the 60s. So there's appreciation, I think, on both sides. There is a feeling of like recognizes like going on there.
And I'd imagine also, for when they discovered Mason, it's like, wow, this is like one of the most extreme guys you can meet. And he's like an old guy. So I guess, it's not a fad.
Yeah.
It's a kind of guy you can look up to in some ways if you're already into that kind of shit.
I think he's 40, right? He's born in, no, he's older than that. He was in his 50s then.
Well, he would have been older than, Moynihan considerably.
Well, he's 14 in 66, right?
Uh-huh.
So he's in 52. So what is he in 86 then? Oh, so he's in his 30s still. But yeah, he's older than them, and especially Moynihan. Yeah, I mean, he's probably the most extreme thing they they ever ran into. I mean, he's the most extreme of the neo-Nazis ideologically. I mean, there are, of course, people go and commit massacres. So,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was very, part of the whole thing that they were very into more generally. I mean, like Adam Parfrey runs an interview with a female necrophiliac in Apocalypse Culture. Like, this is just more of the whole. I mean, it's a different specific thing, but more of this whole like general thing that they're into, just this mining of these like the most, awful, negative, violent things that they can dig up
Yeah.
and immerse themselves in, right? It seems kind of hokey today. I mean, on one hand, it's very much like the whole edgelord thing you can see in sharing ISIS beheading videos and,
Right.
footage and stuff. On the other hand, like, it was considered more like cool avant-garde stuff in the 80s.
Yeah, I mean, especially before like the internet too. So,
Absolutely.
it wasn't
But,
as
like,
easy to come on. You could.
Parfrey and Petros are part of the downtown New York art scene, publishing
Yeah.
an art magazine. Like it had a different place culturally than it does now, I think. Because now I look at this stuff and go, oh, that stuff's really hokey. Like, come on, get out of here. Like, this isn't some sophisticated intellectual project.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Walter Benjamin who said that like fascism was like an aesthetization of politics or something like that. And I think this is basically that. It's just finding new kind of aesthetics for fascism, which is connected to this like serial killer fandom and so on. But it's essentially not that different from the original thing because, it was always about death. Fascists even had that slogan, long live death, in the 30s. Mm-hmm. So it's not that different. It's updated, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly pulls on that. I mean, fascism doesn't have a rigorous theoretical base, right? It really is myth and vision in that sense. So there always is a reliance on aesthetics. This is definitely one thing you heard about Trump, and you're like, I can't believe we're going to be like, we're being oppressed by this guy who like, can't we like at least have like some flash uniforms and big rallies in the streets that terrify us? Instead, we got this totally hokey guy who dresses like shit. It's the worst. Trumpist art is the absolute worst stuff. So, I mean,
well,
at least
I guess we're getting a military parade now, right? Is
no, yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, it's more like some like terrible, dumb Latin American dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
Like,
but like even more hokey than any of those I can imagine. It's like even more of a caricature.
Yeah, I mean, Hitler I think he had a good eye. I mean, that we all remember that flag, right? Everyone in the world knows it.
So. I always think of the Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry teaches the little kid to, see the swastika and the kid's like, oh, it's so cool. Up and down and up and down. Yeah.
So would you agree that there are like three phases in development of like Mason's siege approach to Nazism? The first phase being like the formulation of his approach in Siege from 80 to 86. The second phase, propagation and aesthetization of this ideology by the Abraxas people in the late 80s and in the 90s. And the third phase, which would be the attempt of this ideology being adopted by militant groups such as Atomwaffen division, which started, I guess, in 2013 or around there.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. There is a big fallow period in the aughts in particular, where the book is out of print. Someone does put it online between that. But yeah, those are the three main phases of it for sure.
So there is no section about the Atomwaffen division in your book. Was that your decision from the beginning?
Well, I spent 5 years. No, it wasn't. But I spent 5 years working on it. Mm-hmm. I was kind of living in secrecy because I had attracted way too much attention from fascists. Some people know I was accused on the night of January 6th of being the QAnon shaman by a major Trumpist figure.
What? Yeah.
There's a Vice documentary about me. It's like 9 minutes long. If you if you want to know more about me, I'll meet people and they'll be interested in me, my work. And I'm like, just here, like, watch this documentary. Like, I'll come back in 10 minutes. I'm going to go get a glass of water or something. You can answers most of your questions. So a lot of crazy stuff was happening to me at that time. And so I originally was going to write about Atomwaffen and these post-Atomwaffen networks, but it was just overwhelming. And it really didn't have to do with how the ideas and how the book was created and how it was disseminated. So I'll leave that to someone else. who is perhaps more interested, or maybe I'll do it someday. There isn't. It's funny. Again, you would think there's all these people working at think tanks and people in secret services and stuff, journalists who've written about Atomwaffen and the networks that come after it. The other groups, Zone and Krieg Division and the base. And then Terragram, and then the new things as it combines with the child abuse cults like 764 and Maniac Murder Cult. But no one's written a history of that in the last 10 years either. I don't think there's a single overview document that I've seen about it, report or otherwise. So some of this, there's a lot of individual stuff as it goes along. So there's an odd lack of documentation. But yeah, I didn't include it. I was originally, but I just was, after 5 years, I was totally overwhelmed.
Which is fair enough.
Yeah.
The book is 450 pages long and there's 30 chapters. Like, what else do you want here?
Yes, it's huge. Yes.
Yeah, the last thing you probably wanted to do is, sift through Iron March leaks or something.
No.
Oh God, reading. Yeah, I can't even, my brain was just boiled near the end of it. So
Atomwaffen Division adopted, siege ideology, and Mason really supported Atomwaffen and was their advisor or something like that. But does this really make sense if you actually read Siege? Because they had a group that had a name and a logo and a web page, and they publish videos of them doing training together and so on. Wasn't the whole point not to do things like that and to be
that part is that part is definitely in contradiction. Well, having a web page and spreading propaganda is not a contradiction,
but not as a group. I would think.
Yeah, as a group. Yeah, it's a lot of. They said they were into Mason. I agree with you a little more than they enacted his ideas, right? They weren't going out. Most of them weren't going out and committing these high-profile massacres. Like this is, I think people got into Siege because they saw things like Breivik and Tarrant, in Christchurch, and they're like, "Oh, Mason's book matches this stuff, and we need more of that." But there are no big, high-profile massacres committed by Atomwaffen division members, although they have promoted this idea, and more recently with Terragram people, they have been connected to these as the ideas have sort of rolled on after them. But yeah, they're the ones who essentially reprint a third edition of Siege. It's Iron March, but Atomwaffen is coming out of this platform in 2015. They find him. They come make pilgrimages to his apartment. There's all these pictures with him. I mean, Mason just must have been over the moon that because he had adored Rockwell and he said that people should follow Charlie, and now they're following him, right? The student finally becomes the teacher. And so, but they form an organization. They have specific chapters. There are members. The whole thing about the members had to read Siege. Apparently there was a test you had to take. I was told that by a former member. And the idea of organizations and tests and stuff and memberships, this was what Mason was arguing against. But they picked up his ideas. They propagated his ideas. They fetishized him as a person. And so he was very pleased with that. But he did act as a spokesperson, I think, on a couple occasions, including announcing the dissolution of the group.
Yeah.
And I think he says something then that about organizational structure, and that was never his idea. He dissolves it. I think another member complains that they sort of jumped the gun in it, and Mason was pushing to dissolve. What had happened is that in the States, I don't know how many of your listeners are in the States or elsewhere in English-speaking countries. In the States, there's no banned list of domestic terrorist organizations. People think there is, and it's referred to by politicians, but there's not. Because of the First Amendment, you can't ban an org by itself. You can ban foreign groups, though, FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. Yeah. And that ban is very strict, and you can't go anywhere near it or touch it or have any kind of direct contact or provide funding or anything, and the feds will be all over you if you do that. So what happened is that Atomwaffen, because it was a structured thing, had an official affiliate in Germany. And so the feds are like, hey, well, why don't you use the FTO law against, it's an American-based org, but they're international. Why don't we then use this law, which would make, arrest everyone in that group? And that's when it hadn't used it yet. That's when they dissolved the organization to avoid being entrapped or being labeled an FTO and then having the full strength of the federal government come after them.
Right.
Yeah, so they dissolved, but actually they renamed to National Socialist Order. And then it was confirmed publicly that one of the leaders, Joshua Sutter, who was a Nazi Satanist, was actually a Fed, like informer for 20 years. And after that, they had a purge of Nazi Satanists, allegedly, from the National Socialist Order, and officially became like against Satanism. But then later on, they somehow found out they actually still have a bunch of Nazi Satanists. They had a new purge, and they split into two groups. One which called itself National Socialist Revolutionary Front, which was supposedly the anti-Satanist one, and the openly Satanist part became the National Socialist Order of Nine Angles, right?
The NSO9A.
Yeah, and I think in the end of the last year, although I don't know how, like Denton is, I think, still affiliated with the National Socialist Revolutionary Front group, which is supposedly anti-Satanist, and Denton was like one of the leaders of the Temple of Blood, so I'm confused about all of that. But I think in the end of the last year, the non-Satanist part also officially dissolved themselves. So maybe they finally figured out that they're not supposed to have a group, at least not one that we know about.
Yes, it's all very confusing. And then there's the fighting over the American Futurist website. I didn't. It's funny again. Like there isn't a good history of the Atomwaffen splinters afterwards. That it's in one place. Yeah, I don't know that NSO. People say that it's Atomwaffen renamed, but I think they were already sloughing people off, right? And NSO 9A reprinted an edition, the 6th edition of Siege, right before my book went to the printers, because I think I mentioned that briefly in there, which they denounced Mason and Mason denounces that.
So there's that hilarious video.
Mason there. And then Temple of Blood, again, I believe some of the members become the Satanic Front, but this stuff is all very confusing. And what's a group today, right? Is a group just like a private Telegram chat? So like, does the group exist or not if people aren't chiming into the chat? Like, I don't know. I mean
I know for like Satanic Front at least was a little bit like too easy to join, in the sense that like they had, if you had like a Nazi Satanist or any kind of Satanist, like say Facebook sock puppet, they would just invite you into a group and just post all this shit. I mean, they got, banned after a while pretty quickly because they were just not careful at all.
And they were also like officially fine with working with a Fed. Like I think they had no problems with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was known that Sutter had been an informant. I mean, this wasn't secret information.
Yeah.
Back when I was watching Perazzo soon after he was attempting, or he was cooperating with Sutter, briefly before, when they were trying to like court the North Koreans and stuff. And I mean, it was known then, and that was like, I think I published an article on Perazzo in 2012 anonymously for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and like that was already, I found out, I'm like, why are they working with this guy who's already testified against others? So the whole thing is very, very, very strange with him. But I mean, Sutter was a clever guy. He took a large amount of money from the Feds, and he used it to propagate Order of Nine Angles doctrines and his own work. And then I think eventually got into 764 stuff. Yeah. I mean, he's still running around, right?
Yeah, he's still out there.
I mean, it's the ultimate insight role.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, it's a little bit too real for an insight role, I guess.
I mean, you gotta kind of give it to some of these people. You're like, you did pull that off, right? Like Mason was able to create these ideas, spread them, get them out in the world, spread them, people pick them up. He never went to prison for these ideas. His prison time always involved teenage girls. Or other teenagers, right? And so he's pulled it off. He did what he wanted to do in life, and his ideas have gone out into the world and affected all kinds of people and inspired murders. Like the plan worked, as I say in the book, eventually.
Yeah, and he's totally fine with that.
He's no
content.
At all.
Yeah. I mean, his life's ambitions have been, later in life, of course, have been achieved.
Yeah, which he probably did not think in like the early 80s.
These guys, yeah, he wanted it to happen a lot earlier. I mean, these guys are just kind of, I mean, they're interesting intellectually, but they're sad. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
my phrase for them are, especially murderers, is like empty people spreading emptiness. It's like, is this really what you wanted to do with your life? Especially when you're like 14 or something, right? Like there's been a move lately, and there already were young people. The guy who founded the Feuerkrieg division was 12 when he founded it.
Yeah.
And there seem to be more and more very young people, 12 to 14 or something, into this stuff. And you're just, it's just sad to watch it. And they go kill people. And you're like, that was your life. You just you threw away other people's lives. Like, couldn't you have gotten into like self-help and yoga videos or something?
Yeah.
Or, anything else, like listen to metal or something, but, don't be a Nazi.
Form an industrial band.
Form an industrial band. Yeah, do it.
So do you see something like the fourth phase for Siege? Like, is something going on currently, or do you think will be going on soon?
Well, I mean, what's happened is that this series of groups that formed Atomwaffen and the ones that come out of it and model themselves on it, like mostly the energy went into Telegram. So this series of Telegram channels whose leaders have been are being arrested. And now we're seeing this combination of the siege-derived accelerationist ideas fusing with 764's child abuse ideas with people who are promoting and committing school shootings and other massacres, and of course O9A, Satanism and Nazi Satanism, and they're all blending together. And that is a new kind of thing. That's not purely siege-based accelerationism, but it's absorbing some of that and creating this new thing. The FBI calls it nihilist violent extremism, which I'm sure they'll misuse that term, but does capture some of that quite well, because they're all like, they all have different reasons and they're coming together and like committing random massacres, right? We can all agree school shootings and random massacres and violence are good. Yeah. And they're like, okay, well, I see the logic behind that. Yeah. So it's fading off in one direction. In a strange way, kind of why the Abraxas people were interested in Mason in the first place, which was, the fetish of these just extremes, the fetish of serial killers and murderers, right? And so it's almost coming back to what some of the stuff was in the beginning. Because, like, why have it even be political? Like, is this ever really political at that point? Or that part of it, is that part of it really political? I mean, I never got this. There have been many, many white supremacist murders and massacres. Like, they're not getting any closer to destabilizing society, much less creating an Aryan revolution. No. Like, are they actually serious? I mean, some of them must just get involved in the movement and believe these ideas, just adopt them entirely. But like, this is clearly not a successful strategy. Like, you're just killing more and more people, and then nothing happens other than like you've murdered a bunch of people, right?
Well, oftentimes they go out, with it too, right?
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they
not
don't.
Always, yeah.
Mason says you should go out with it, especially in the 70s. He advocates this, but I don't. He'll take whatever he can get. And so it's blending back into just this, fetishization of violence for its own sake, which is the maniac murder cult, perspective, really, right? They are just, they say Satan and they say National Socialism, but really they're just like, we want to see violence. We want to intentionally encourage people to commit violence. You should record it and put it online. The worst possible OPSEC in the world. Yeah. Right. And so it just comes back to a full circle, just a full nihilism.
Yeah.
Horrible, horrible shit.
Yeah, which is often what we end up with.
Yes.
That's,
I know.
You finish talking about some of this stuff and then you're just like, well, that was terrible.
Yes.
I originally was interested in some of this stuff through cross-recruiting people like Troy Southgate and National Anarchism. So I wrote my first big article that people really read in 2008 about this. And some of those guys, like people in the French New Right, Alain de Benoist and stuff, are more sophisticated and are saying something that is interesting that I think people on the left do need to counter their ideas about identity and culture, right? But then it, on the other end of that is just these, people going and committing, under the thinnest pretenses, like murdering other people, right? That's depressing. At least the other stuff has some more, Dugan, whatever you think of him, like there's stuff to read there and consider, to whatever extent you want to do that, right? It becomes the more interesting, to me, more interesting end of this other stuff.
Yeah, although there is a connection between the two, right? Abraxas people are in a way some kind of a proto-alt-right or some kind of a more subcultural equivalent of the European New Right in some way. And like Moynihan even moves into that direction openly, right?
Moynihan definitely moves into that direction. European New Right has some influence on Metzger. Like one of the ex-leftists working with him, John Jewell, wrote for the Scorpion, which is this British paper that was directly was taking New Right ideas and publishing them in English.
Which is
there are
another ex-Wobbly, right?
He is also an ex-Wobbly. He was a much more prominent Wobbly. Again, I have people who are mutual friends with Jewell who are Wobbs in the 70s. Like I had people tell me about their experiences with him in person. A lot of these things kind of intersected with my life in different ways, not like directly, but one step away. So yeah, the Abraxas people they did want something. They wanted something more sophisticated, right? But in a way like the French New Right, and Moynihan did. I mean, Moynihan, you're right, but he kind of does that later. He gets very into the French New Right stuff. He gets into heathen stuff. He maybe, again, I realized writing the book that he becomes friends with and absorbs the idea of Stephen McNallen, the sort of main racist heathen. And some of those ideas are about this, like, full decentralization, ethnic, like low, very small level, micro-ethno-separatism, right? And this mirrors, I don't know to what extent it is influenced by, or there's a back and forth with these French New Right ideas as well. And Moynihan is interested, always a curious guy, reading broadly, I think, is interested in both of them and puts them together, especially he starts this publication called, is it Tyr or Tyre? It's Tyr.
I guess I think it's Tyr. Yeah.
And he publishes both these currents in it. It's a much more intellectual kind of thing. It's these book-length journal issues. And he eventually gets a PhD in, I think, Middle German studies. I heard a really crazy story, though. He went to UMass and got that on Blue Sky after I published an article about the counterculture stuff in a music platform called Quietus. And a bunch of people came to me after that. And one guy said, I don't know if it's true or not, but somebody did say this to me on Blue Sky. He had been in Moynihan's dramatic studies program. And Moynihan got a Fulbright scholarship and went to Austria, where they figured out who the people in the original UMass department didn't know who he was. People in Austria did, and he is alleged to have his Fulbright pulled, and then got ostracized in the department. This other person who again told me this. I like this story, and always generally try to check whether these things are true or not. That they did let him finish in his department. He does have a PhD, but they were like, "You're never gonna be a professor."
Right.
I mean, the world of Middle German, linguistic studies, and you must be rather small.
Yeah.
Someone told us that he's actually rich. I think he said himself. I think it's mentioned in your book that he's like upper middle class. But someone told us that he's like actually quite rich.
I could not find direct evidence of that. My book has thousands of footnotes. I 0% surprised his dad was a high-powered lawyer in Boston. I mean, I do think he's Boston Brahmin. I surely believe he doesn't seem to have worked a lot, and he had a lot of time and money to travel to Europe as a teenager and publish these books and stuff at a time when it was much more expensive to publish books. You couldn't print on demand stuff. And he published a book before Siege. A bootleg copy of Nietzsche's
Antichrist.
Antichrist, right? Which I think he liked the title more than the content of, but
for sure.
So he's running around and doing all this stuff. He doesn't really seem to be working very much. So yeah, I that's probably right. I would, and there's a famous Moynihan clan, which he may or may not be connected to.
Yeah, someone told us that he went to like a very expensive private school. I think, like high school. Yeah.
I mean, it's that tracks. I couldn't. I think he dropped out of high school though, and then went to Europe. So, I mean, he does seem like a rich kid. But if you're a listener and you have evidence of this, reach out to either me or Empire Never Ended.
Well, I mean, Spencer, I think we kept you for quite a long time now. It's almost 2 hours.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a quick 2 hours.
Yes.
Yeah, right?
Yes. So people should go to your Patreon, right?
Yeah, where can they best support you? Now, again, I'm going to say Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism. from what I can tell, it's available pretty much everywhere.
Well,
anywhere
Routledge,
you can buy books online, at least.
anywhere you can buy books. I think only one bookstore that I know of actually carries it, which is kind of sad.
Oh,
But yeah, you can order it online. Routledge often has on their website discounts periodically. You can get it through Bezos if you need to. I think it's cheaper there.
Right.
I have a Patreon if you want to support me. I'm not funded by anyone. It was I went into a lot of debt writing this book, is the truth. You realize how much like scholarship is dependent on a lot of money being behind you.
Yeah.
How that changes things and what people can write books. And I have a PhD and I come from a middle-class family. I certainly could not have done this without, having that background. If I had to take care of a family with children or anything, or like, my parents can take care of themselves. If I had those obligations, I could not have created this. So I hope it is a worthwhile tool for other people. I have a Patreon. Like I said, I'm not funded by anybody. The think tanks that work with the security agencies don't love me. And I'm not a professor. So the usual, you can sign up now for Patreon for a week for free. And my things start at $2 a month, and I get paywalled exclusive content through that. It's the main way. That's my main source of income. Buy the book. There's also on my website, there's a list of all my articles. In particular, you may at this point in the historical juncture want to read my guide, 40 Ways to Fight Fascists, Street Legal Tactics for Community Activists. There's free downloads of that.
Seems very appropriate right now. Yeah.
It's actually, I'm working on a third edition for Microcosm Press. Nice. As soon as I get off the show, I need to go back to that. And you can follow me on all the socials. I'm on like Blue Sky, I'm most active. I recommend that one. And like Twitter and Threads and Instagram and Facebook. I have a website. I do, even if you don't want to give me any money on Patreon, you can sign up and just get the public articles. You don't have to pay any money. And that's probably, as the social media platforms go in and out, if you just signed up for a free subscription, you'll get the announcements of new articles or books or talks or stuff. I've been giving talks. I think I just gave my 21st talk since the book came out.
Nice.
Lots of podcasts like this. I think you're going to be my final podcast about the book. I am giving a talk in Richmond, Virginia, I think 2 weeks from Sunday, depending on when this show actually drops. And that'll be my last IRL talk for a bit. So if you're in Richmond or Charlottesville, which is about a half an hour away, I think half an hour away, please come down. Details TBA on all of the socials.
Yeah, well, you heard it here. No, I mean, you really, I really admire the research you've done. It's quite extensive. It's very impressive. And, James Mason liked it, which is a weird endorsement, but we really think it's an excellent resource.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I really like your show. I'm a supporter of your show on Patreon. Oh. Well, you paywall the good podcast, so I had to keep my arm. I was like, fine, I'll do it.
We should really unlock more. I promise we're going to do that more often. We just forget we're lazy.
Yeah. So anyway, I love your content too. I always like, there's certain things I know a lot about, but the things I don't know a lot about are always very interesting to listen to. And last, I just want to give a shout out to Jeff and Mike, since you both asked me when I'm going to be on the show and encouraged me to be on the show for many, many months now. So.
Well, thanks, Jeff and Mike.
Yes.
He's so excited. I'm waiting for my, as soon as the show drops, for my text from them, my signal messages.
Well, dude, thanks a lot. And, I hope we talk again.
Yeah. Thank you.
Although, I always say that, and then I'm like, usually with this show, it's going to be something bad if we have to have somebody somebody who specializes in siege culture on the show.
Well, maybe not. Sometimes we do talk about something nice.
It's
extremely rarely, but it happens.
It does happen.
Yes.
Yeah, I always say what's good for me is bad for society.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, thank you for having me on the show. It's been really fun.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Bye.
Ciao.
Ray here. I had a dream, and it was that I won't be working in call centers anymore. And you can help that dream become a reality by going to patreon.com and subscribing. And if you're German or Austrian or Anti-Deutsch, whatever you people call yourselves these days, doesn't really matter. The fact is, your grandfather killed my grandfather. He marched down the street in my hometown, renamed the square fucking Adolf Hitler Square. You think I'm kidding? All of this actually happened. And you should feel bad about it. I don't care if you were born in 97 or wherever you were born. This is not normal behavior, okay? You're not normal. I know people from all of the continents, no one thinks you're normal. But there's good news for you. We made a special tier just for you so you can pay 10 times as much as a normal person would. It won't make you normal, but it will make you feel better. Okay, thanks. Bye.